And we are live. It is June 5th, 2023, and I am live with Leslie. My name is Talia. I am in the Office of Civic and Community Engagement, and these are our community conversations. I'm going to allow my guest to introduce herself, and then we're going to get right into our questions.
Hello, my name is Leslie McGraw, and I'm a digital strategist and um, the founder of the Albert Williams Voting Corner and Social Justice Corner.
I am so excited to talk about your advocacy and the story of Mr. Williams, and then also how that has inspired you to inspire others across the country. So, why don't we start with, could you tell us a little bit about Albert Williams?
Sure. Um, Albert Williams was born and raised in Brownsville, Tennessee, and uh, he and about 70 other Black folks in Haywood County, which is um, it's a small county. And for point of reference, we just recently lost Tina Turner. He was born maybe 10 minutes away from where Tina Turner was born in Nutbush city limits. And so our family had been in Tennessee and established that place for about 75 years as enslaved persons and then as sharecroppers. And so he was kind of the first generation that was not a sharecropper, was not an enslaved person. In fact, he was a fireman at the Sunshine Laundry, which is like the equivalent of like a dry cleaners now. And he and his wife worked there. And on March 12th, 1939, after some, like a year worth of deliberation, they all created the first Brownsville, Tennessee branch of the NAACP. And so there was no problem with them, getting it started. But shortly thereafter, there was talk of if we want to address the issues of the day in our community, which were police brutality, um, no like kind of checks and balances and accountability for the federal funds that were coming through that were not being fairly distributed at the state and local levels, or if we wanted to address like land sort of disputes or land issues, owning land, we need to have some sort of presence in the courts or some in the legal system, and you can't do that without being a registered voter. So that's where they started, and uh, so 5 people attempted to register, and that just got everybody all in a flux. So prior to that, the families, there was some mixing of black and white. It was no big, well, there were issues, but there weren't any like a lot of hatred. It wasn't like a KKK formed, but that just really made everyone angry on the white side of town. And so there's this terror campaign um, ensued, and in the end of the year, they were told they didn't want them to meet anymore. The NAACP was not welcome, and so that Christmas Eve, the president's home was burned to the ground. But they were given a heads up, so they had moved out of town. And so then Albert Williams, who had been a secretary, became the president, the acting president for the NAACP. And so they were having like secret meetings. And in June of 1940, he was overheard at the corner store, thus the voting corner, uh, organizing the next meeting, the next secret meeting. And somebody snitched and said they heard him talking. And so on June 20th, 1940, the sheriff elect, Tip Hunter, came to his home and asked for him to come outside for a minute. And so at 10:30 at night. And so when he came out to the porch, his wife saw another police officer, as well as the president of the Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Coca-Cola bottling manager from the local Coca-Cola bottling plant. And then they kind of shuffled him to the car, and there was a whole row of cars that turned their lights on. If you've never been to Brownsville, Tennessee, even now, in when it's late at night or even after the sun sets, it's extremely dark. It's like pitch black. So not until everybody's lights came on does she know there were so many cars out there. And so he was taken to jail, then released, you know, to give an alibi of sorts. And then he was taken out near the Hatchie River and beaten and mutilated. And um, no, but we didn't find that out until later. So on June 23rd, some fishermen were fishing at the Hatchie River and saw what looked like a body part that was being weighted down, and his whole body was there. So they had a riverbank inquest right then and there, and so his wife had to identify the body. I never was clear on whether my grandmother was with her aunt or not. One point she said she was, and then when she felt that I was asking too many questions, then she said she wasn't. But she described his body in graphic detail. And so um, his wife had to flee to New York immediately the next day. And the rest of the family were like targeted for, like my uncles had people throwing rocks at them on the way home from school. So it's kind of like by being a victim, they were still, our family was not only victimized, but then they were further victimized because um, it made national news, and so they don't know how it was leaked to the national NAACP, but there was a retaliation because they wanted to be able to kill people when they needed to, but they didn't want to be seen as racist, or you know what I mean.
I do. And for me, your personal history is tremendous. And I think that it's so sad that these stories are forgotten. And when I met you, Leslie, and when you had told a little bit about what had motivated you to come to the space that we had met in, I was so inspired because I know that you know that I shared with you that my grandmother marched with Martin Luther King. And that's part of my family legacy, fighting for civil rights, especially the right to vote, of which in Puerto Rico, Latinas did not have, who were illiterate in her time when she was born. So suffrage, suffragettes, like people who, like Albert Williams, made a decision that day that will, like you said, affected their entire family and so many people for generations. Like they're American heroes to me. Like Mr. Williams is an American hero to me. And that's one of the reasons why I have been so anticipating of this interview, because I think just being able to help you further tell the story of that era and of the way that your family was impacted is what we need to continue to do to lift up why it's so important that we can vote. And the short span of time, I mean, folks feel like it was a long time ago. We're talking about 1940. That was within my grandmother's lifetime. So for those who are just tuning in right now, and maybe those who cannot see our image, we have an image that's presented, Albert Williams Voting Corner.com. Can you say a little bit about how that project has shaped and what folks can do to further support?
Sure. So, so in January of 2015, I received a package, like a UPS package with a lot of information about my uncle, and it was in a letter from a white investigative lawyer out of Tennessee, and he was saying that he wanted to write a book about Albert Williams, because he was the first, voting rights martyr. Two, he wanted to create some sort of historical marker. And three, he wanted to exhume the body so that he could reopen the case. And so I was the closest willing relative that was available to do a DNA match with that. And so I think I got it on a Saturday, the package. And by that Friday, he and the historian on the Albert Williams Memorial Committee were in Ann Arbor meeting me at the Outback Steakhouse. And so it was just a whirlwind of activity. I had a lot going on in my own life, but you know, I learned so much. They gave me a three-ring binder with, I don't know, maybe 300 pages of information that they had gathered, because before you can get a historical marker, like you have to support it with all this different evidence. And so some of which I had seen before, but a lot I hadn't. Like I saw my original birth certificates for and death certificates and marriage certificates for relatives and such. And so I just got completely consumed with this, and I did a number of interviews when I went down there for the first time in June for the 75th memorial, because my uncle never had a funeral. He never had a memorial, none of that. It was all, in emergency status, refugee status. And so, um, through the course of the last 8 years, I've done, dozens of interviews. I've been on NPR. I did a long term project with StoryCorps, and cousin and I, with Frontline and StoryCorps, that ended up being presented as part of the Juneteenth exhibit a few years ago at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York. And in 2017, I think it was September 2017, I testified before the Tennessee legislature to have the case reopened, from the standpoint of how our family has been affected by his killing. And so during that time, I met a lot of politicians down there, up from all sides of their political leanings, that were interested um, in seeing justice of some sort. Everybody has different ideas about the justice, and so the case was reopened in 2018 by DA Gary Brown, District Attorney Gary Brown. But then it was, closed again in a few months, because the closest person that would be able to testify would have been my grandmother, who at that point was having a lot of memory issues, and she was in no shape to do anything like that. And then there was the grandson of the sheriff, who just wasn't ready to do any sort of testifying. So the case was closed, but it did get a lot of national attention. For the first time, you could Google him, and find out more about him. For the first time, there was a buzz. The lawyer did a tour, like a speaking tour about it. And so, but I wanted something that wasn't just planted in the past and the history of it, which is important. And I do, want to continue that. But I also wanted to bring it forward. And I have been kind of juxtaposing it in my own life and my own civic and voting engagement. And so, uh, last July, I think it was July 22nd, I I woke up from a dream, like an actual dream. I went to sleep, and I often get messages through my dreams, and I saw Albert Williams at the corner store leaning against the post, and he said, "You have to educate the voters. They need to know this information. Listen, we've just got to get this information out." And he was, kind of just talking, and I'm like, "Who is he talking to?" And I kept looking to see who he was talking to, and I just couldn't get a good enough angle to see who the person was. And then I looked down and I saw my own feet, my own bare feet in the dirt. And I said, "He's talking to me."
He and Leslie, it's so crazy that you had that dream and that moment, because meeting you really impacted me. Even when we met in that digital space, and I remember reaching out to you and saying, "Hey, I want to do something like active, like today,"
Yes.
because to your point, Leslie, this is your story. This is your family stories. And how many times do we have people tell our stories for us? So, with our future collaboration and the media project that we're doing, is really going to center on person first and family perspective storytelling. So, can I ask you, what is it like to be a storyteller when there are certain parts of either your family or the community where this happened that are hesitant to talk about it for very real reasons? What does it feel like to be able to lift his story up? And then also, could you say a little bit about where you are and why you are there, like physically?
Okay. Um, okay. So the first part of that question was, if I'm hearing you right. So the hesitancy. So yeah, it's important to note that um it wasn't, I didn't have to strong arm anybody for this position to speak about my uncle, because the lawyer sent out um maybe 10 packages to family members, and I was the only one who responded. Well, that's not true. That was one of, there was actually a couple cousins that I didn't know that responded to, but all the Michigan family did not respond. And my grandmother uh was initially upset that I responded. But me and my grandma were really great friends. She died 3 years ago. And so I explained to her why it was important to me and everything. And she said, well, she gave me her blessing. She said, I just don't want you to get hurt. So and when she would speak about it, there was still a lot of fear. Like, you know, at that point, she was 75 years removed from his death, but she still was 9 years old in that area of her being. And she had um, no inkling to want to be a part of it, not to go back to Tennessee. She didn't want any parts of it. Although through the years, she's told me lots of stories about how she loved Tennessee and how, she just had a really great childhood up until she had to leave. But there was just so much pain and so much fear. And then I have an aunt that, when I found out why she didn't want to be a part of it, was because she kind of, which I'm not saying she's wrong, she blamed his murder on why her mother passed. Because my great grandmother, so my grandmother's mom, and Albert Williams were brother and sister, and they were very close. And because of his murder, she really took it hard and never recovered. And back in those days down south, they white doctors really didn't touch black patients, and so she was given um, tranquilizers, like for a horse, whenever she would have fits of crying or she couldn't stop moaning, she would just yell his name out. And on her deathbed at the age of 60, she was talking about him. So her youngest daughter, who's the last one still alive, my aunt, my great aunt, um, she doesn't want to talk about Albert Williams because it's interconnected with why she lost her mom at the age of 15. Do you know what I mean?
I absolutely know what you mean, and I think that there is a story to tell about the physical and generational health impacts of racism, white supremacy, and certain types of violence that really travel through so many different communities, but from a health perspective are never really talked about. Thank you for sharing that. So can you tell me, how does it feel to be the storyteller in the family, to lift this up? Because I do feel very motivated by you and by this desire to spread awareness of what I really consider was Mr. Williams' bravery in the face of a power structure that he knew was larger than what maybe some of his efforts were.
Right. So I'm I guess I'm just so proud of who he was. And um and because I wasn't there at the time, so I didn't have the direct um fear connected with his death, that I'm just able to see all that he did, all that he tried to do in a short amount of time at a very young age. I think now it would be unheard of, some of the things that he did at 29 and 30 and 31. I shouldn't say unheard of, but rare. And he did a whole lot in just a few years. And uh, although I have naysayers and people that may not want to hear it, or I might have resistance from maybe family or community members, I'm not at risk for somebody like taking me out to the river and getting beaten by dozens of people. Do you know what I'm saying? So I feel like I have a my bravery, or whatever it is, my call to task is, it pales in comparison to what he had to go through.
I feel as if so honored to be able to help you tell this story and continue to lift up Mr. Williams' legacy. I know that you know that I shared with you that I was a member of the NAACP here in Buffalo.
Mhm.
And we have a very strong leadership with Pastor Blue and Angela. And also, obviously, for those who are listening who do not are not familiar with Buffalo's history, we had the Niagara Convention. We've been part of the Underground Railroad in the past. So Buffalo has always kind of been known as like this beacon of freedom. And I feel humbled that you're willing to share parts of your journey with us on student radio here at 91.3. And SUNY Buffalo State University is a place where we do have the privilege of having an Africana Studies department, and we have, faculty who are empowered. And I know I've been talking to other folks throughout higher education where they're in states, right, Leslie, where the states are telling them what they may or may not teach. And that oftentimes is impending on our ability as Black and Brown folks to tell our own histories. So I feel very honored on behalf of the university, who has a even more larger privilege to have a Black woman be our president, to be able to be part of this history telling. And then also, very seriously, the call to action that comes with anyone that learns Mr. Albert's story. Because
Mhm.
I think when you learn about Albert Williams, like for me, it was like, okay, so what do I do, Leslie? So we
Mhm.
want people to visit your website, right? Um,
Mhm.
what other thing? I know we want people to be more aware, and we'll share later in greater detail about the collaboration that you've been so willing to have with us here as a part of our digital leadership program and storytelling efforts. But for those of you who are listening, we will be working with Leslie to further tell stories and do that within our own community. But you did mention Juneteenth, and that's coming up, and that's a huge day here in Buffalo to take the perspective of celebration. Leslie, what lessons can we learn from your own personal journey that you've learned as you've been celebrating Mr. Williams' life?
So so, oh boy, so much. Let me start with, you know, I'd like the Juneteenth celebrations. I've always, wasn't always, maybe since maybe 14, I've always celebrated Juneteenth. So that's a lot of years for me. And so I've always been excited about it. And some years have been very, very educational. Um, a couple of Juneteenth experiences were, very academic, and, where do we go from here? Sustainability, so forth, so on. But I am a huge proponent of having joy and jubilee, like the actual, sometimes we're so busy trying to get our freedoms that we forget to be free.
Absolutely.
And so, when I get too attached to, 'cause I volunteered a lot of years with Juneteenth, I get too attached to the mechanics of it. Like, I'll just go, I'll say, well, I'm not available, and I'll just go and just have fun. I love the cakewalks. I do poetry there. Um, I've helped just move chairs, but I don't want to be locked into now. Let's chronicle the whole Black experience and create a game plan on our Freedom Day.
Right. It's a lot emotionally.
Right. And so one of the things that I did not know until after 2015. So one thing that was amazing for me for the 5 years or almost 5 years that I had with my grandmother after this discovery, of, and coming back from the memorial, my grandmother started to open up about him, because from the time she first mentioned in when I was 9 years old until, like, 30, well, 20 something years, almost 30 years later, she only mentioned him 3 times. And then she would close off the discussion. But she talked more freely about him after, like, the memorial. Like, it opened something up for her. And she talked about him having a sense of humor and him liking to dance. And his they used to call him Dickie. He was like a fun guy. And even the night that of his kidnapping, so there's a whole, like, theory within the family, and this is documented in our part of our family story. It's called The Legacy of Tamar. And on that night, it was the same night as the Joe Louis fight, and Joe Louis won against, I believe it was a Russian man. And they were all listening. The reason that everybody was ganged up at one house was because they were listening to the fight, and so he had just won. And one of the Black neighbors said they were going past the watering hole where there were a lot of white men drinking and talking, and they were, um, he could hear them saying that, do you see all those lights on? They think there's something because, this, white man was beaten up by Joe Louis. Like, they were seeing it as a personal affront that all these Black homes were lit up with joy.
And
So,
and
yeah,
and Leslie, did that also mean lights of like a radio or a TV? Because when I think about the story of the line of cars, the infrastructure of rural communities being able to see lights for miles, that is in my head. So what they meant, like full of activity, or do they also
they
mean like
just could tell
lighted
they
up?
were, yeah, no, they were just housed. Like, during the fight, there were people that were just up,
Yeah,
they
like
could,
listening to the radio and stuff.
yeah, listen to the radio. There's, people on the porches. There was just movement in the Black area, and they could tell it, and they were intimidated by that.
How
Um, mhm.
how I just don't know the words to be able to process the timing of that, right? And then of his ultimate kidnapping, it's almost impossible to propose that they're not related.
Right, right, right.
Um, and then in that moment, that was a moment of celebration. So it was like they wanted to steal that moment of joy.
Yeah, because the initial um, plan, according to his boss, was to rough him up. So they did not kidnap him for him to be killed. They were just going to rough him up. But I imagine some extra alcohol, more people, and then being upset by the, all this Black joy going on. Um, they just went ahead and went further.
And as we enter a time where we're bringing our interview to close, Leslie, like thank you so much for you fully appearing in our space and sharing your stories and sharing the vulnerabilities of storytellers at this time in America, lifting up the legacy that you're sharing of your ancestor. For those who are fighting voter suppression, for those who are out working to actively engage folks in voting work, what advice would you have for them, Leslie, reflecting on Mr. Williams' legacy and how he informed that work? Because there is no us voting without sacrifices like he made.
Right. Okay. So when I think about people that are in the trenches for voter suppression, uh, I just cringe when I hear, people um, kind of just guilting people to vote. You know, like I think we have to allow people to understand, like we have to listen to why people are not voting, and um, and then allow them to have that space to get there, because we nobody knows, um, but nobody always knew what they know now. You know what I mean? And so when I think about the people that um, that I know that don't vote, a lot of times it's more confusion. So in the marketing world, which is where I swim a lot, I was taught by a professor once that a confused buyer or a confused customer never buys. And so I think it's the same thing. A confused voter will not vote. And so until we break down really easily whether I go to the city clerk or the county clerk, municipal clerk, or the township clerk, like those things you shouldn't have to Google. Like it should be clearly laid out. Do you know what I mean? So and those um the old folks used to say the devil is in the details. When people don't understand how things work, that's the area for suppression. That's the real area for suppression. Because
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. I was going to say, I saw a news report because there are Puerto Rican people that are moving to Tennessee and parts of the South where a man was told that his license from Puerto Rico did not qualify as identification in that southern
Hmm.
state.
Hmm.
And that's the type of thing that I think you're talking about when you're putting yourself forward, trying to navigate the system, and then you're being told the documents that you have aren't sufficient, or that you have to bring 12, Leslie, and there it's like
Hmm.
14 different points of documentation that you have
Right.
to bring, like more than you need to confirm your identity with folks in other jurisdictions. And I think about the Puerto Rican and the Latino community in Tennessee, and I pray that they're going to know Mr. Williams' story. And I think that I feel very honored by your willingness to tell it with us here, but also to do this pre-interview with me, because you will be joining us at 91.3, and folks will have the opportunity to call in and ask questions. And that's why I think the pre-interview is so important, Leslie, so they can hear your story and hear what you're bringing. And then hopefully if folks have questions, they can meet us on the radio at 91.3 WBNY, because you are an inspiration, as is your family, to so many people nationally, that I think it's important that this story be told over and over again.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And I can't tell you again, my grandma Martin Luther King. My father was a police officer. I take
Mhm.
the story of Mr. Williams and all of the intersectionality that occurred very seriously. And I think it probably uh, like, I'm gonna say this 1,000 times, Leslie, but he is an American hero, as are you. And I just feel really grateful to be able to help you on your journey of sharing his legacy and the joy. For those of you who are listening, Juneteenth is a great time of celebration, and there will be information that I will link to the Juneteenth celebrations here in Buffalo. And Leslie, I'll work with you so I can make sure that I can highlight whatever is going on in Michigan,
Yeah.
and maybe some of the digital spaces, like if
Mhm.
you're in a location where they're not celebrating, where you can join other spaces in other ways. But Leslie, as you close the space, can you remind folks how to get a hold of you, like on the website, or if there's other things that you want them to do in between now and Friday?
Yeah. So the website, it just is albertwilliamsvotingcorner.com, and I just broke it apart from my parent site so you could just focus on Albert Williams and the voting corner there. Also, the the parent brand, I guess, would be TruStory Success with Les, and you can find TruStory Success on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, and that's TruStory STORY, and then success. And in those spaces, I'm on there every day, and sharing informations around voting and justice, and and police brutality. And I want to dedicate, today's show, if I can, to two individuals would be turning 30 today, and they are Breonna Taylor and Tyree Nichols, would have turned 30 today.
Leslie, you are a hero. Thank you for highlighting their stories and for coming to our space. And thank you in advance for your time on Friday. This will be shared both on YouTube and on our Facebook. And again, I will thank you for just spending your time with us, but also for your efforts to lift up an American hero. I sincerely appreciate you just talking with me. And I can tell you that I'm deeply inspired by you. So I'm just very grateful. And I will make sure to let everybody know how to celebrate Mr. Williams' life, because I think that's equally as important as learning his story.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.